the machine gun.
On us, machine guns, yes, day and night on us. And we were hungry, and we had only a very, very small place to sleep. So it was a terrible situation. And in my mind, so we were suddenly changed into the position of the Indonesians. I am Anne-Ruth Wertheim. I'm born in Jakarta in Indonesia in 1934. So I'm very old already. I'm becoming 87 in October.
Wow. You wouldn't say that. Serious, you would not say that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Then my parents kind of immigrated, but they considered Indonesia their own country at the time because it was a colony. Right. So they just went there because my father couldn't get a job here in the Netherlands because it was the 29 crash on the. So it was a crisis, kind of third.
Yeah, and the economic crash. Yeah.
Yeah, and then he became in the first place he became a judge, and later on he became a professor in sociology or in jurist. He was a jurist. He was a lawyer, and my mother was a lawyer as well. She studied jurism as well. Right. And they lived in Jakarta, and then they got my older sister, and then me, and then my younger brother. And so we were living there as a colonial family, white people in the middle of a very large amount of Indonesians. But in our home, we only, in fact, were together with our servants. So my first years were kind of, I was a spoiled child, you could say. It was normal for me to be served by many servants. And we almost never came to the kampung where the Indonesians themselves lived. And
right, and you called that a kampung, right? Those were the areas where the indigenous Indonesians were living.
Our houses were built of stone, and their houses were built of bamboo. Yeah?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And, what I saw, because sometimes we were visiting them, so the families of our servants, then I saw children walking on bare feet, and I was, in fact, I was jealous because we had to wear shoes. But then, and they were playing around, of course, and we were kept a little bit more in all kinds of this was not allowed, that was not allowed, and so on. Okay, but then so the picture I had from the world was in fact that we were on top. I was 7 years old. I'm describing now the situation when I was 7 years old.
Right.
And then I was in school, and of course there were only white children in school. When we went to the swimming pool, there were only white children there. So it was a complete divided society. And then at that age, the picture I had from the world was white people were on top. Then on the bottom, there were the Indonesians, but in between, there were the Chinese. And I think that's a very, very important thing, because I saw them when we went to shops. They were the shop holders, the commercial people.
Right.
So in my image, in my opinion, they were in the middle. And now I think that maybe it's important to change now to the way my father was thinking. So maybe first, at that moment, the Japanese invaded Indonesia, and
that was during the Second World War, right?
Yeah. Yes. So that was in 1942, and then from one day to the other, my life was completely destroyed and put upside down, because then we were put in jail. In fact, we were in prison. There were the Japanese were putting as much as possible, and in the end, all of the white people, so the white Dutch, because you had also mixed peoples, of course, people, of course, Indonesian, Netherlands, the Indo-Europeans, they were called. And that was a very big group also, and maybe we will talk about them later, because they had a very complicated position there, because they were in between the Dutch and the Indonesians. But what the Japanese did was to put us in closed internment camps.
So to jump in for a moment. So you're saying that completely changed your worldview, because the Japanese were actually only putting the white Dutch people in camps, not the Indonesians at all.
Not the Indonesians, not the Chinese as well.
Not the Chinese.
It's not a mixed group, just the white people.
Only the white people, okay.
Only the white people. And then, so the strange thing was that what I had seen in the kampongs of the way of living of the Indonesian children there was my destiny.
Yeah.
So certainly, those camps were horrible. We were threatened by violence. Also the children had to look when some people did something forbidden. So this was a kind of warn us not to be naughty. Also, the children. We were day and night watched by soldiers in high towers of bamboo, and they were putting their mitrailleur,
their gun, yeah.
Their yes, automatical.
Yes, their machine gun.
On us, machine guns, yes, day and night on us, and we were hungry, and we had only a very, very small place to sleep. So it was a terrible situation, and in my mind, so we were suddenly changed into the position of the Indonesians.
Right.
In the campus. It was about comparable with the situation we saw before the war.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Japanese were in charge there, were suppressing us, you could say. And we were guarded by Indonesian soldiers, part of them. So part of the commanders of the camp were Japanese, but they had Indonesian soldiers to watch, to guard us.
Yeah. And so and how was that? I mean, that was a reversal of the roles also for the Indonesians. Yes. So suddenly the Indonesians were the masters, so to speak, in the camps, and the White Dutch were the inferior group at that moment. How was that?
Yes. Now I think that I should bring in. They were not so happy, those Indonesian soldiers, because they were also beaten and suppressed by the Japanese, and we could see that. But there was one thing, they had enough to eat, and that was the difference with us. So maybe we can later on say something about there was a trading between us and them, because they wanted to flee, vluchten.
Yeah, they wanted to flee.
Yeah, they wanted to flee. So they were not so happy.
Oh, right.
So we gave, they had khaki clothing, of course, and they had their hats were shorn bald, so they couldn't flee. But we had, of course, some clothes left. After years, we didn't get any new clothing, but we had clothes, of course, not in the color of khaki, khaki, and they so
khaki is the traditional clothing, or
no, khaki is the color of military.
Oh, the military. Oh,
yeah. So they were recognizable outside the camp, outside the place. So it was difficult for them to flee. But when we gave them some clothing, they gave us some of their food. And this trading was, of course, forbidden very, very much by the Japanese. And if they captured one of those soldiers, Indonesian soldiers, then they were beaten severely in front of us, in order to have the Dutch woman, of course the children didn't do this, but the Dutch women that did the trading, they tried to, so it was a kind of torturing in front of us, in order to have us admit who was the one that traded those clothes.
Right, and so the Indonesian soldiers who would get beaten, they wouldn't point to the person who did it.
Ultimately, yes.
Ultimately, yes. Right.
Yeah.
So that must have been a terrible experience. And so how did that develop? You eventually came out of the camps.
Yeah.
So how did that go? Like how did you guys?
No, it didn't affect my view on Indonesians at all. I thought that I could understand their position very, very well.
Yes.
We all, my mother and most people around us also were very, very sorry for those Indonesians who were beaten until blood. It was really terrible. And maybe I can go first before we go to the end of the war. Maybe I should point out the position of my father, because when he came to Indonesia, he was Jewish. My mother was not, as I told you. So I was half Jewish, and that had some consequences as well. I will tell later. But my father was a young man when he came to Indonesia, of course, and he had experienced anti-Semitism a lot. So he knew what it was. And so
right. And the experience of anti-Semitism, that was in the Netherlands, correct?
In Europe, yes, in Europe.
Yes, in Europe.
Not
and that...
in Holland, but yeah. So then he came to Indonesia, and then he he saw in Indonesia two completely different kinds of racism. The one was towards the Indonesians, and that was the kind of racism that he called this exploitation racism. And that was, and the other kind he saw towards the Chinese, because the Chinese were having the commerce. And maybe I can tell. So I think, and then this was he called this competition racism in analogic to anti-Semitism.
Right. So you had exploitative racism. You say that was to the indigenous Indonesians, a kind of looking down on people, a kind of downwards racism.
Disdain. They were called. By the Dutch, they were called stupid, lazy, all kinds of looking down kinds of prejudice.
Right.
But the Chinese were not stupid at all. They were, of course, also, you could say that they were lazy as well. And then it's impossible to say that they were lazy. They were working very, very hard. And so the kind of prejudice that he saw towards Chinese was sly, unreliable, and very hardworking, of course, but they were competitive. They were so the Dutch were afraid of their competition. They were competing, and it was very difficult. Of course, you know that in Indonesia, even the rechtssysteem,
judiciary system,
was so that also the Chinese were suppressed. So there was they were called vreemde Oosterlingen.
Strange Easterners, yellow people.
No, in the juristic system.
Oh, in the judicial system.
In the juristic system, you had two layers, and then you had that strange foreigners or something. But so you had the Dutch. If a Dutch man did something like stealing a bicycle or something, then he was punished in a in a normal way. But if an Indonesian stole a bicycle, he was punished very, very severe. And so the Indonesians were in another kind of court. The court was Landraad.
Okay, so there was a separate court for the indigenous Indonesians.
Yeah.
And but also for the Chinese.
Now
Am I correct?
Yeah, the Chinese, but that was they were in the Landraad, so they went to the same juristic court as the Indonesians, but in general they were treated a little bit better.
A little bit better. Okay, yeah. So you had the Dutch, you would say, that were on top in Indonesia. In the middle, you have the Chinese, who were also seen as competition by the Dutch because of they perceive
commerce, of course, and also in some other fields.
Yeah, commerce, making money, and the Indonesians were seen as more as unintelligent, lazy, stupid. You need to lead them and control them.
Also, Karim, bijgelovig.
And superstitious. So they were seen as superstitious people. Right.
Yeah.
So, Anne-Ruth, you said before that when you and your family were put in the camp, that you felt this feeling of a role reversal, where previously, the Dutch people had been at the top, enjoying, a higher quality of life, better housing, etc. So that feeling of role reversal, it sounds like you had already witnessed violence against the Indonesians perpetrated by the government, by the state, by the courts, the police. So your feeling of role reversal, was it just the conditions of life that you felt reversed, or did you also feel like the threat of violence had been reversed in a way?
No. I was only 7 years old at the time, and the kind of things I registered as a child was the way servants were treated. So, for instance, we were, even those little children, where we could give orders to servants. I think that my parents at that time were already a little bit changing to attitude of not being colonial. Maybe I can tell later, because my father was one of the very few Dutch people who were convinced that the Indonesians had to be free. But in our household, when I was a little child, there was the situation was that I could not ask, but just tell our washing babu servant to wash my clothes. So that was what I registered. And in other families, I really saw children screaming at the servants. So, for instance, give me tea. I remember,
Right.
that a child was ordering this to the Indonesians. So that was what I saw, but not really violence, or I had no idea of the juristic conditions or something, of course.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So for a child, that must be very, how can you say that is very hard to understand when you just assume being born on top. A little 7-year-old girl, you have no idea that suddenly you see these Japanese come in who are not white and being so controlling and fearful, and so powerful. That must have been a very, very scary experience, besides the camp, just seeing that role reversal.
Yes. Now, from that moment on, when I left the camp, I was almost 11, we didn't go to the camp right away. So I was a little bit older than 7 when we went
11.
in. Yeah, but no, then 7. Sorry. So the Japanese came in when I was 7, but when we went to the camp, I was almost 9, and when I left the camp, I was because they didn't put the Dutch people all together at the right in the beginning, so it was. But I was almost 11 when I left the camp, and then I knew exactly what was racism. I understood.
Right.
So that was the beginning of understanding several eigenschappen,
Characteristics.
characteristics of racism. One of them is keeping secret things. That's a very important onderdeel.
A feature.
Feature.
Very important feature. Yeah. Aspect.
Aspect of racism. And then violence, of course, threatening with violence. And the problem of belonging to a certain category. And I think that maybe to explain this, I can tell what happened about our being Jewish partly. So
yes,
when we were in our first camp, after about a year, then that was in 40. At the end of 43, December 43, then we were already end of 44. Then we were already in the camp for a year, and then suddenly the Japanese had an order issued at the whole camp that all the women and children who had only 1 drop of Jewish blood in their veins should register. And then my mother was in a very difficult position because she wasn't Jewish, but my father was. And there was almost no contact between women and men. My father was in another camp. We even didn't know whether he was still alive, and there was no contact between them. Only you could write some words once in half a year, and it almost never reached the other. So she didn't know whether he was going to register as a Jew. So she didn't know whether whether the Japanese knew about us being in this complicated position. My mother being not Jewish, and we, the children, 3 children, were half Jewish. And then what happened was that she was talking to girlfriends, trying to figure out what she should do. So if she would admit how the situation was in reality, she not Jewish, we half, then it could be that the Japanese would take us to the Jewish camp and leave her in that camp.
Right.
So then she was separated from us. That was one possibility. If she kept it secret, then there was a possibility of betrayal, because those women were, of course, all in a terrible situation. But so on the one hand, there was a lot of helping each other, but on the other hand, there was a lot quarreling and disputes between people, and of course jealousy and all kinds of human features. So it could be that one of those women would betray us, because the name Wertheim is in Holland, in the Netherlands, it's a very known Jewish name. So, so she was trying to figure out what kind of decision she should take, and then finally she came to, in my eyes, a very clever solution. She registered herself also as Jewish. So,
very clever, yes.
Yes. And then she and the three of us were taken to that Jewish camp.
Right.
Yeah.
And if I can quickly ask you, so that seems to be an amazing kind of combination of so many racial issues in one life. It's amazing. It's Jewishness, colonial Netherlands, being white, Japanese invasion. So you even see there that the Japanese were collaborating with the German Nazis to separate Jewish people in Indonesia. That was in fact to help the Nazis.
Yes, yes. There's proof that some Japanese were influenced by the Nazis, and we have in my website I wrote down about this, but I think that an important indication of this was also that the Japanese put the Jews and the Freemasons together in one group of thinking. So maybe I can tell about my father. The strange thing is that after the war, we discovered that my father had not registered as a Jew, that he could have done that, but he just thought, why should I, together with 2 or 3 other Jewish friends in that man's camp, they decided not to register because they thought, why should we give more information to the Japanese than they have already, seeing that they always use differences to punish one more than the other, and so on. So but there was a barrack, there was a hut.
Barrack,
Barrack in his camp, and that was called by the prisoners Tel Aviv. As a kind of a joke.
About what was it called? Sorry?
Tel Aviv.
Tel Aviv. Yeah. And in that barrack, the persons, the men who did register, were put in that barrack. But they could walk around in the camp, but they had to sleep at that place. So he could have registered as a Jew, then he should have been in that barrack. But there was another thing in his camp, and that was that 3 categories of people had, we all had to wear a number, so a prisoner's number, that was in our camp also, even us, the children. But my father, in my father's camp, there were 3 categories who had not only this number, but on top of it, a little triangle, a red triangle. And then you belong to one of those, one of 3 categories, either being Jewish or being Freemason, Vrijmetselij, toch?
Mm-hmm. Yes, correct.
Or prominent. And
So Freemason, Jewish, or prominent?
prominent, yeah. So of course that in the thinking of the Japanese, that was all being this for preparation for being gijzelaar.
For being, how can I say that?
Hostage or
Hostage. For taking. So what was prominent? What did prominent mean?
Yeah. So my father, who was a professor in Jewish diction, hoe noem je dat? He was one of the prominents.
Okay, so that means like somebody of a higher socioeconomic status?
Yeah.
That's prominent. Okay.
This among the Dutch, higher is inside the Dutch.
In the Dutch society. Yeah, right.
Yeah. But the nice thing about this was that after the war, he told us about this, of course. And then he said he was very, very glad that he had this red triangle, because it meant that you were considered more dangerous than the other prisoners. But for that reason, you were not allowed to do do work outside the camp, corvée.
Right. So to do duties outside of the camp. So you were not allowed to do. So why did they see him as more dangerous? I don't understand that part.
That was what the Japanese said. They considered those three groups as more dangerous than the other prisoners. Therefore, they had to.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, but I think that the important thing about it is also that it proves that this ideology of the Japanese to separate Jews from non-Jews was given in by the Nazis, because this combination with Freemasons is typical for them, for the ideology of the Nazis.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know if either of you have heard of this, but there's this paper I read about the so-called Fugu plan. So during the Russian-Japanese War around the turn of the 20th century, a Japanese officer got a hold of a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And they believed it. They believed that it was true. So during the war, there was a plan to try to bring in as many Jewish people as possible to occupied Shanghai, because they believed that since the Jews run the world, if you had a bunch of Jews who were supporting the Japanese Empire, then the Jews that run the world would also support the Japanese Empire. But then what happened was the Nazis found out about that and then put pressure on the Japanese to end the program. And I guess it gets complicated there, but some Jewish people were saved because they had created, good relationships with the Japanese occupiers. But the interesting thing to me was how you could get this foreign kind of racist idea, and it just gets adopted completely in a completely different context. And it sounds like you experienced, or your father experienced, the same thing.
Yeah. I know about this situation in Shanghai. And of course I know about the protocols and the way they were used. So
then you also, and if I can jump in for a moment, then you can also see how subjective and easily manipulated this racism actually is. Like, if the Japanese had never heard about it, they would not see the difference between any of the camp people. But because there has been invented this kind of categorization of people, for example, by the Nazis, that is very important, that somebody is Jewish Dutch, suddenly people are being seen differently, treated differently, and your whole reality changes. That must have been very extreme experience for you as a child.
Yeah. I think that maybe it's important to just fit in with that this dividing the Jews, separating the Jews, Jewish prisoners from the Dutch, that it didn't happen everywhere in the archipelago. It happened only on Western Java, and it seemed to be connected to the fact that the commander, the Japanese commander, Mitsuo Murase, he was influenced by this kind of thinking. And he was the one that on Western Java introduced or ordered this. So the strange thing is that if I tell about my experiences to other Jewish Dutch people who have been in camps in Indonesia, sometimes they say, I don't know anything of this. I was also in the camp, but it didn't happen at all. So that's important. About this Murase, this Japanese, I have done some research on him. He has been executed by the Allies in Jakarta in 49. But I couldn't find anything that pointed about the separation act of his, that this was part of his doodvonnis.
Part of his death sentence?
No. So it didn't. But his death sentence was because he had been very, very cruel in the Pt.1. Pt.1 was, say, the Gestapo of the Japanese.
Right, but there was nothing in the sentence that referred to him being anti-Jewish.
No.
Right.
I also figured out whether he was, as you know, there is a shrine in Tokyo where dead soldiers, but also 14 misdemeanors are their bodies are there, and they are, hoe noem je dat? I know that even Premier Abe went there every year to honor them.
Yeah, to honor the soldiers, the Japanese soldiers.
Yeah,
from
but
the
there were also 14 criminals, war criminals. Yeah.
That's a pretty big problem here in Asia as well. I've seen a lot of discussions about that, how Japan still celebrates these war criminals, or at least the Prime Minister Abe.
Yeah, I know. And but I was, of course, curious to figure out whether this Mr. Murase was one of those 14.
Right.
Yeah, but he isn't.
Oh, he isn't?
No, but he is executed.
And he was executed by the Allies here in
Allies in Jakarta in
Jakarta.
49. But I think that also maybe it's important that my personal experiences when we went to that Jewish camp, so after this order, so at a certain moment we were, so my mother registered also as Jewish, so at a certain moment we had to go to the porch of the camp. Then there was a truck, an open truck, and you had to stand in the back, the laadbak.
Yeah. So you just had to stand in the how can you say that?
The bed of the trunk?
Just in the how do you call it? The big box of the truck where you can stand in.
Just the bed?
It's open in the open air. Like
just in the truck. Yeah,
like animals. We were standing there, and it was about 20 women and children. And then we went to a station in in Batavia, so in Jakarta, as it was called Batavia at the time. And then at that station, there at the perron, on this
Platform, station platform.
at the platform, we saw many other mothers and children, Jewish all, of course, some Freemasons also. One of them my mother knew, and those women and children were all coming from other camps in West Java. So
Right.
So that was what happened. And then we went into a train, which was a terrible journey because the windows were closed, we were for hours inside. It was very hot. We didn't get anything to drink, food of course not. There was an emmer, hoe heet een emmer?
Bucket.
A bucket you had to pee and to rest there. It's just horrible. Then we came to the station of Tangerang. It's about 50 kilometers from Jakarta, from Batavia, but they were all the time going forth, and so we were for hours in that train. And then we came to the station of Tangerang, and there we had to walk to the prison. And that camp, Tangerang, was not the kind of prison that we came from. We came from a prison that was in fact a neighborhood of Jakarta that was surrounded by those bamboo things with prikkeldraad.
Yeah, fences with barbed wire.
Oh yeah, barbed wire. And of course, those towers with the guards inside. But this camp had been a youth prison. And the strange thing is we have been visiting Indonesia 4 times last years after the falling down of the dictator Suharto. But until he was there, we never went to Indonesia, but afterwards we went 4 times. And we have visited this prison because it's still in use now. And it's used for girls who did dealing with drugs. We could go around and so on. But in this prison, the strange thing is always that everything is always more complicated than you think, because then it was a Jewish camp, but about 2/3 of the 2,050 people inside, women and children, Jewish. No, sorry, not Jewish. 2/3 of it were Jewish, and 1/3 was not Jewish. So I also once met some non-Jewish person who had been in Tangerang, and he said, there's something wrong with what you tell, because I was in Tangerang, I'm not Jewish. And so that's the complicated thing. But in fact, it was most of them were Jewish, and they all were coming from other camps. And that's important in this respect, because for us, it was much worse than the camp we came out. But for some people, friends of ours who we met there, they came from a very, very terrible camp in Jakarta, Chideng. I don't know whether you know, because Chideng, that was the commander was had a sickness of the mind. It's called moon sickness. He was completely psychotic.
Insane,
so,
yeah.
Insane. And so what they had been through before they came to the Jewish camp had been worse. For them, it was an improvement.
Right. So that was a terrible camp under a crazy and there was a Japanese also, of course, right?
Sonai. His name is Sonai. Sonae.
Sona. Sonai.
E-I. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
that prison that you were in, that so-called Jewish prison, but there were also non-Jews. That for those groups who came from that prison camp of Sonai, they saw it as an improvement. And how was that new camp for you? Was it also for you an improvement, or was it actually?
No, for us it was much worse. It was because in the camp that was only a neighborhood, it were small houses. This not it were the kind of houses where not the most rich Dutch people lived, but in those small houses you had rooms, of course, and in one room we were living together with another family. So you were crowded as well, and you had only one toilet and so on. And we were hungry, and we had to stand in roll call every day a few times and so on, and all those punishment and so on. So it was terrible. But the Tangerang, the Jewish camp was worse, because it was a prison. There were big rooms where you lived with 80 or more people, and you had to be on wooden platforms, 2 layers on top of each other, and of course, at that time, of course, that's important too, that the Japanese were losing a little bit the war. So for them, it became more and more difficult to feed all those prisoners. So we got less and less food, and also the degree of violence increased. So that
Right.
was what you found out, of course, by the way we were treated.
Right. So that was a kind of frustration of the Japanese that they were losing the war, and they were actually expressing it to you.
Yes, okay, yeah. As I know now, that we didn't know that when we were in the camp, of course, that the Indonesian population was starving, hunger as well. There was a lot of hunger the last period of the Japanese occupation.
Right. And that's what I want to go towards that a bit. So how long were you in that camp? So how long did you stay in that Tangerang was the name?
Yeah, was only a few months, 3 months, and then the whole Tangerang camp was transported to another camp. It was a terrible transport as well, but that was again in Batavia, in Jakarta, and that was were barracks that had been used for coolies, so say laborers.
Yeah, Indonesian workers. Yeah,
Indonesian workers who had to be transported to Sumatra, to the tabaks plantages.
So to the tobacco plantations. Yeah,
tobacco plantations, and so those barracks were used for us, and there we there the same situation was. About two-thirds of the camp was Jewish women and children, and 1/3 was non-Jewish women and children. there came some people. You know, I think that what occupiers always do, I think, if they put people in jail, is they are afraid of people standing up.
Right. So they.
So if people in a prison are too a long time together, then they can think of kinds of
Collaborations.
Yeah.
not collaboration, just
Yeah, they
opstand.
can think about
The
working
collaboration
together.
together to stand up
Yeah,
against
right.
yeah. So what they do is to divide camps all the time and bring the one time to the other and so on. So
Typical divide and
the
conquer strategy.
population was all the time changing. And I think that's all, maybe also one thing that comes that was important in my youth was to experience that some oppressors on top of you can all the time make you you have some friendships, of course, with children. I had in outside the camp, of course. So then I had to go to the camp. Then I was in the camp. I was making new friendships with children, playing around and so on. And then I had to go to this Jewish camp, and then from the Jewish camp to another camp. And you know, they all the time deprive you from your friends.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So you never have any kind of certainty in your life. There's always somebody above you who can just decide anything for your life, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that an important thing in this is also that my mother, the one who was supposed to protect me, that she couldn't help, that she couldn't do anything about it. And I could see in her eyes that she was also suppressed. And that's very, very frightening for a child.
Yeah, so your own mother, the one who is supposed to protect you, especially for a child, that's the only one, and your father, of course, but he was not there. You can rely on, and you can you experience as a child that even your mother was powerless against these people above you, so to speak. Yeah, and that probably also influenced the way you started to see your position in Indonesia, right? Before that, as a white person, as a white Dutch person who were actually also on top and controlling the life of many.